My name is Leonard Marsh, and I am 71 years old, and I spent 27 years as an electrical engineer specializing in security systems, and I want you to understand what that means before I tell you what my stepdaughter accused me of, because electrical engineering teaches you one thing above all. Others, which is that systems are only as reliable as the evidence they produce, and I spent 27 years designing systems that produced reliable evidence, and I applied that same principle to my home long before I needed it, and it is the reason this story ends the way it does. And I want to tell you about my stepdaughter Vivienne before I tell you what. She said because the portrait matters, and Vivienne was 29 years old when I married her mother Helen, and Vivienne was not a child, she was a grown woman with a career in pharmaceutical sales and an apartment 40 minutes away, and she came to our house on holidays and maintained a studied politeness toward me that I recognized from my years working in corporate environments as the specific politeness of someone who has decided you are temporary and is waiting for the evidence to confirm their assessment. And Helen was aware of the tension the way spouses are aware of things they have chosen not to examine too directly, and I loved Helen, and I did not want to make the tension a larger thing than it needed to be, so I accommodated, and I was patient, and I told myself that Vivienne simply needed time, and time passed, and things did not improve. They simply stabilized at the level of polite minimum contact, and then Helen was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease, and something shifted in the dynamic, the way things shift when illness arrives in a family. And what shifted was this: Vivienne became more present, and her presence was not about Helen. It was about the house Helen and I owned together, a 4-bedroom property in a neighborhood that had appreciated significantly since Helen had purchased it before our marriage, and I noticed Vivienne taking an interest in the house the way I had always noticed things in my professional life, by paying attention to what the system was actually producing rather than what it was supposed to produce. And one Saturday afternoon, Vivienne arrived unannounced while I was in the garage workshop, and she walked through the house with the focused attention of someone conducting an assessment, and I noted this and said nothing, and 3 weeks later, Vivienne called Helen, and the call lasted 40 minutes, and after it, Helen came to find me in the kitchen, and her face had a quality I had not seen before, which was conflict. And Helen said, "Leonard, Vivienne has some concerns about your behavior." And I said, "What behavior?" And Helen said, "Vivienne says you have been inappropriate with her." And I set down my coffee cup very carefully, and I said, "Helen, I need you to tell me exactly what Vivienne said." And Helen told me, and what Vivienne had said was specific and false and designed in a way that I recognized from my years in corporate environments as the architecture of a claim that is very difficult to disprove without evidence. And the reason I say this is that I am an engineer, and I think about systems, and the moment Helen told me what Vivienne had said, I thought about the security system I had installed in our home 2 years earlier, not because I suspected anything at that time, but because I always installed security systems the way other people install smoke detectors, which is before you need them, not after, and the system covered every common area of the house with time-stamped high-definition footage that's stored to a cloud server I managed. And I said, "Helen, before we discuss this further, I want you to come with me." And I took Helen to my home office, and I opened the cloud server, and I pulled up the footage from every occasion Vivienne had been in our home over the preceding 8 months, and Helen and I watched the footage. Together, and Helen is a thorough woman, which is one of the reasons I love her. And she watched every relevant segment without speaking, and when we finished, she sat in the chair beside my desk for a long time, and I waited. Because some conclusions need to arrive in their own time, and then Helen said she lied, and I said yes, and Helen said all of it, and I said all of it, and Helen said why, and I said I think you know why, and Helen closed her eyes, and when she opened them, there was something in them that had not been there before, which was the particular clarity of a person who has seen something they cannot unsee, and we did not contact Vivienne that evening, and we did not contact her the next day either, and the reason we waited was that I called my attorney Stephen the following morning, and Stephen listened to everything, and then he said, "Leonard, bring me the footage," and I brought him the footage, and Stephen and I spent an afternoon going through it, and when we finished, Stephen said this is complete and clean, and I said, I know that is why I designed the system the way I did, and Stephen said, how do you want to handle this? And I said, I want the record to be clear, and I want Vivienne to understand what the record contains. And Stephen sent a letter to Vivienne 3 days later, and the letter was specific and professional, and it contained a detailed description of the footage that existed and the dates and times it covered, and it made clear that the footage contradicted every specific claim Vivienne had made, and that the footage was preserved and documented and available, and Vivienne called Helen the day she received the letter, and the call was much shorter than 40 minutes, and Vivienne's voice on that call had a quality that was different from the studied politeness I had always received from her. It was something smaller, and Helen listened, and when Vivienne finished, Helen said, I watched the footage, Vivienne, and the line was quiet for a long time, and then Vivienne said, Mom, and Helen said, I need some time, and she ended the call, and Helen and I are still in our house, and Helen's Parkinson's is being managed, and I still maintain the security system the way I always have, and I think sometimes about the 27 years of designing systems that produce reliable evidence, and I think that the most important thing an engineer learns is that you build the system before you need it, not after, and if someone is constructing a story about you, I want you to hear this reliable evidence is always more powerful than a well-told story, and the time to think about documentation is not after something happens, it is before, and the system I installed 2 years before I needed it. It was the most important thing I ever built.